Now, the election and secession are the moments where, in the lead up to the Civil War, right? This is the last few months before war breaks out. And so at this point, you have to sort of think back and say, okay, at this point, is Civil War inevitable, right? Is it inevitable once Lincoln is elected? Is it inevitable once Fort Sumter happens? Was it already inevitable? What about the counterfactual? What if Lincoln had not been elected? What if the election had turned out very differently? Why didn't all the southern states secede right away? And why did some southern states not secede at all? Now here's a map of the presidential election in 1860. Now the Republicans nominate Lincoln, right? He's not even on the ballot in the South, right? So he needs to win all of the North to win the election, right? That's 2/3 of the total free population. That's a lot of people that have to be in favor of Lincoln. The Democrats are divided along sectional lines, right? So the Democrats are split. There are some Democrats in the South, a lot of Democrats in the South. They nominate Breckinridge, and he's someone who calls for expansion of slavery into South America, into the Caribbean. In the North, the Democrats nominate Douglas, right? Who calls for more popular sovereignty, right? He's calling for let people decide themselves. There's also a fourth candidate for some Whigs, which is also more moderate in the North, and that's a man named Bell. So Lincoln has the advantage of his opponents being split three ways, in many ways, and the Republicans are quite strong, but he still needs to win the Electoral College because of the traditional placement of Electoral College by population. And the election takes place on November 6th, 1860. Now, the election actually has a quite low turnout, high for today's standards, but low for the standards as they exist in the 19th century. Only about 40% of people who can vote. It's the first time, and Lincoln ends up winning, and here you can see the breakdown. He wins, gets 303 electoral votes. You can see the breakdown of the states and the popular vote. He wins both. So once Lincoln is elected, it's the first time that a president has been committed by his party to restrict the expansion of slavery, right? He's not an abolitionist, nor is he committed to abolition. He's not committed to end slavery. He's just committed to stop the expansion of slavery, right? Slavery is not going to expand into these new territories. He's committed to basically suffocate slavery, right? So it can't expand. It can only stay in the South. And the South just cannot support this, right? They believe that if slavery can't expand, that it will die, their economy will die, and that they will suffer. So in December 20th of 1860, South Carolina secedes, right? And this is just a few weeks after Lincoln wins. They held a special convention to determine whether or not they would leave the Union, and the vote at this convention is unanimous. Right? They determined that Lincoln's victory is not just a victory; it's an end of their way of life. And here you can see the states that seceded right away: that's South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Now, the rest of the states in gray, they don't secede right away. They don't secede for a couple more months, and then there's a few states that have slavery that don't secede at all, and then the red is in the Union states. So this is South Carolina secession, at the top one in 1860, and the bottom is Jefferson Davis's farewell. So at the top, it's the Union now subsisting between South Carolina and other states under the name of the United States of America is hereby dissolved, because whenever any form of government becomes destructive of the ends for which it was established, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government. Thus was established the two great principles asserted by the colonies, and the right of a people to abolish the government when it became destructive of the ends for which it was instituted. An increasing hostility on the part of the northern states to the institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations, and the laws of the general government have ceased to affect the objects of the Constitution. Thus, the constitutional compact has been deliberately broken and disregarded by the non-slave holding states, and the consequence follows that South Carolina is released from its obligation. And so there's a question of like, well, does the state have the right to secede? Does any state have the right to secede? Is the Constitution, the Union of the United States, is that binding, right? When you ratify the Constitution, is that binding? Can a state ever leave? By February of 1861, 6 others leave. Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas, right? So they leave about 2 months after South Carolina leaves. This is what Jefferson Davis says. Jefferson Davis is the president of the Confederacy. So when all these states leave, they hold, they create a new government, and that government is the Confederate States of America. So Jefferson Davis says, when the states themselves and when the people of the states have so acted as to convince us that they will not regard constitutional rights, then and then for the first time arises the doctrine of secession in its practical application. Now these 7 states create a Confederate Constitution. It's a copy of the United States Constitution. It's exactly the same, except it guarantees slave property. And they elect a new president, Jefferson Davis. He's from Mississippi. Now, there are 8 other states who are not ready to secede, including Virginia, right? That's Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, who eventually do secede, and Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, who stay in the Union. And this presents a dilemma for Lincoln, right? There are three groups of states that he needs to appeal to. He needs to appeal to the Union, right, the base of his popularity, the people who voted for him. He has to appeal in some way to the 7 states that have seceded if you want to get them back. And you have to appeal to the 8 states on the fence, right, prevent them from leaving. So Lincoln needs to really keep those 8 states, prevent them from leaving. And he needs to sort of unite the popular opinion on free soil. So Lincoln's inaugural address in March 1861, he states that he will sacrifice Republican Party platform. Right? He will sacrifice this. He will sacrifice the abolishment of slavery in D.C. And he will ignore the sort of the abolishment of the internal slave trade, but he won't accept secession. Right? And he won't do this because he wants to encourage the South to stay in the Union. But he does decide to end slavery in the territory, right? So he's trying to create a middle line, right? He says, okay, we can slavery in D.C., you can keep the international slave trade, but I'm not going to accept secession, and we're not going to have slavery in the territories, right? And he needs to really rally the northern states, and he can't do that by attacking the South, right? So he also really needs to get the South attacked first if it turns out that the South is sort of recalcitrant. So he needs to put the North on defense, right? Make the Civil War where the North is not the aggressor, but they're the defenders. Here comes Fort Sumter. Now, Fort Sumter is an island fortress in a harbor in South Carolina. And it has some cannons. It had some cannons, although it was really just recently completed at that point, right? It's a garrison that is in a very sort of important place defense-wise, but it hadn't been, there wasn't a lot of armaments there. Now, it's especially important because it can control shipping into Charleston and therefore into most of the rest of the South. Now, Lincoln doesn't send troops to Sumter, but he does send some supplies, right? And he does warn South Carolina that he's sending supplies, right? He sends supplies to Charleston, to some of the federal bases there. Now, the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, determines that they need that harbor, right? So he orders an attack on the fort, which has Union soldiers in it, or federal soldiers in it, and forces it to surrender, which means the Union got attacked first. So the firing on Fort Sumter is when Lincoln comes to send supplies, and Davis attacks those supplies. Right? So because of this, 4 states immediately joined the Confederacy. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joined the Confederacy in April 1861. And although Western Virginia secedes from Virginia and eventually readmitted to the Union as a state in 1863, the events of the secession and the Fort Sumter really rallies the North. Now, the North feels like the South attacked first, but they're rallying not to end slavery, but to restore the Union, right? This is a perpetual Union. And under the Articles of Confederation, the Union of the States would be perpetual, right? None of them concede. The question is the Constitution also intended to be perpetual? In 1861, that's an open question. Eventually, the Supreme Court decides in favor that yes, the Constitution was meant to be perpetual, and they decide that in 1869. Now, Lincoln is able to keep the remaining border states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, and he needs to keep those states, even though they're slave states, right? They remain in the Union, and they remain slave states. The Confederacy moves their capital to Richmond, Virginia, and this is to encourage the rest of the border states to join the South and keep Virginia central to secession, because they have so much wealth in Virginia as compared to the rest of the southern states. So now the two capitals of the United States and the Confederate nations are less than 120 miles apart from each other. So nearly a third to half the fighting in the Civil War happens between these two capitals. And you can see the sort of what we'll call the Eastern Theater on the right here near Virginia on the far right. All of that fighting from the early years all the way through, a lot of them happened right in that area.